What is up, Wizards? It's Dev and Ziggy, SBMTG. We like it a magic, dressed for a wedding. This is how I dress for weddings. To talk about our first deck tech of Crimson Vow Standard. How can that be possible? It's Tuesday. The set came out on Thursday, Dev. You're just now doing your first deck tech of the season? How did that happen? Well, it's because our first deck of the season was the scariest thing that a content creator can possibly try to do, and that's a 3-color aggro deck in Standard. And I gotta level with you. Wasn't super easy this time, but in the end, just when I thought that vampires had completely drained me, I found a list that doesn't suck. So today, let's talk about Mardu Vampires. With good audio this time, we get to take another crack at vampires with decent audio.
Don't sing if you want to live long. They have no use for your song. You're dead, you're dead, you're dead. You're dead and out of this world.
How come when I put on a nice suit jacket, I look even more like a hobo? Why is that? Oh, you're back. Sorry. I was just asking Ziggy some important life questions. But anyway, today we're going to talk about vampires again. Dad, you already did that last season. Well, it turns out there's 6 new vampires in this set. We got vampires in the vampire set. And hey, look, for this video, it doesn't matter that the best wolf in the vampire set is better than any of the vampires from the vampire set. There's still a bunch of playable vamps in Crimson Vow, like Eddie. We get to play Edgar, right? The ECG of MTG. This guy is a little bit better than I thought he was going to be. I was a little reticent to play this as a 4-drop. You could say I had cold feet, but actually, card ain't bad. And hey, Olivia, I get it, right? Not a bad choice for a partner. He brings a lot of power to the relationship because he's an anthem effect. And even after he's gone, he's sired a bunch of lads. You get one child each turn, and his children have lifelink, and that's nice. And eventually, he'll come back. He will actually, a dad that comes back. If only I had that. And when he does come back, he supports those kids pretty well. He makes all those 1/1 lifelinkers into 2/2s, plus like anything else that you might have on the table. He's a resilient card in the deck. Honestly, doesn't have a whole lot of that, to be honest, so it's nice to have something that's somewhat resilient to removal. So there's a lot of actually kind of good things about Edgar that make up for the fact that he's a 4-drop in a 3-color aggro deck. I'm going to go ahead and let you know that Olivia did not make it to the wedding. I know that she's the one supposed to be getting hitched here, but I didn't quite like how she worked out in this deck, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But to be honest, if I had to spend my life with one vampire lady legend, I would not pick Olivia anyway. I would go for Big Anje over here. 4 mana is a lot for a magic card in an aggro deck, but I feel like we had a couple of more slots open, especially for a card like this. Now, there's one Anje in the main and one on the board, but this does a whole lot of stuff for us, so don't let the silver bullet status mislead you, because it's a really cool card in a lot of situations. The 4/5 body is actually pretty good against a lot of stuff right now. You know, a lot of mono green creatures, 4/4s like Seeka's Chariot, Old Growth Troll, and the list goes on, and it's really good against all the dorky mono white guys. A 4/5 body for 4 mana actually isn't too bad in this format right now, and it lines up in interesting ways. Like, you know, a lot of people are playing that new 4 mana 4/4 haste trample thing in mono green. Well, again, lines up pretty well, especially on the play against that card. So I really like the body here, but it's also one of a myriad ways to sacrifice things in this deck, and we have a lot of fodder for Anje. And once you untap with an Anje on the board, then suddenly, if you've got 4-6 mana, you can deal that much damage and gain that much life. So even if you don't outright win the game off of Anje activations, at least you survive the crackback. Even though you tapped all your mana, you can still have a bunch of creatures out. Maybe you just sacked a bunch of blood tokens. Maybe you sacked a couple of creatures because there's plenty of fodder for Anje in this deck. As a matter of fact, you know what makes really good fodder for Anje? Edgar tokens when he goes away and starts pooping out tokens. There's a ton of other awesome fodder pieces for Anje in this deck. So she just does a lot of really cool stuff. She blocks well against a lot of what the format is doing right now. She attacks into the format really well for that matter. And she's decent wrath protection in a way. If you have mana open on your opponent's turn, just sack some dudes when your opponent plays the Doomscar or whatever else, and deal a little bit of extra damage to the face. In the late game, if you have 6 mana or even more open when you play your Anje, you can immediately start getting value off of it, and it does give you immediate value no matter what happens in the form of a blood token, which is that's a lot to, you know, pay 4 mana for, right? That doesn't really give you much for the investment, but at least it gives you some sort of value, even if it's dealt with. There's so much that I like about Anje that I could really go on and on about this card all day. It's charmed me, actually. And I like the name, too, Maid of Dishonor. That's cute, right? Because normally it would be Maid of... But we're also on 4 copies of Voldaren Epicure because it does everything. This is subtly like the best vampire in the deck, and so therefore like one of the best cards in the entire deck. I've been really surprised at the red Thraben Inspector, and even though Thraben Inspector is pretty obviously the better card in most situations, this is the better card in certain situations, and this deck is very good at generating those. I was just talking about certain cards being good fodder for Anje, and this is the definition of that. This actually gives you 2 things in 1 mana to sacrifice to an Anje. So let's say you play Anje on turn 4, you draw this or a land on turn 5, play your land, play Epicure, and then suddenly you still have the mana left to sacrifice both of those things. So that's like paying 5 mana to deal 4 damage and gain 4 life, which is not actually terrible in a lot of situations on turn 5 if you've been getting in damage all game. This is also fodder for various other sacrifice stuff that we have, like Falconwrath Pitfighter. We'll get to that a little bit later. So there's a lot of things that we need the body for, whether it's just to like sack it to something or just to have a body on the board on turn 1 so that we can more easily, you know, activate the sort of semi-spectacle ability of some of the vampires in the deck. This is really good at doing that on later turns. Like it plays really well into, say, a vampire socialite on turn 3, let me say. So there's a lot of awesome stuff that Epicure does in this deck, and there's a bingo card thing with this where you'll sometimes win by just casting this card. You need 1 more point of damage, play Epicure, win game. It will happen when you play enough games. It's happened to me a few times. Although I'm still not quite sure what an epicure actually is. Let me know in the comments. I'm sure that'll generate some engagement. But anyway, next is Bloodtithe Harvester, another brand new card that just kind of does everything. Like, this is going to give us a blood token no matter what. It's actually really nice to curve from Epicure into this on turn 2, because then you can start taking out 4/4s. 4 toughness creatures. And that's actually a huge game against things like mono green again, but against mono white, even when you're on the draw, this will keep you from getting outstatted by a Luminarch Aspirant too early in the game because it has the 3 power. Against control decks, epiphany decks, and whatnot, this helps you go underneath because it's a 2 mana, 3 power creature. It just, again, this thing does everything. It does just about freaking everything. It also works really well with the 4 copies of Voldaren Bloodcaster that we're playing, because when you sacrifice Harvester, you'll get a blood token. And honestly, this works well with all the various things that sack creatures, right? Voldaren Pitfighter, Anje, Harvester again, like all those things will also pay you in blood tokens when they die, so long as you have a Bloodcaster on the table. And if you do have that Bloodcaster on the table, you're getting all that blood. It won't be too long until you flip it over, and suddenly you pay 2 mana for your 3/3 flyer that gives you a whole bunch of 2/2 flyers if the game goes long enough. So this card has actually impressed me, and I knew that it might. But the last new vampire that we're playing is the 3 copies of Welcoming Vampire, which is the other reason to be in Mardu. These the only 2 white cards in the entire deck are Edgar and this, but I think that this is the actual best reason to play white in the deck. There are 25 different vampires in the deck that trigger this in some way or another. Right? Things like Nighthawk Scavenger, which we'll talk a little bit about later, have the ability to trigger this, but don't always. Things like Edgar, when it dies and starts creating tokens, it will trigger this once a turn, and on your upkeep too, so it's really just like a one-sided Howling Mine in that case. Plus, it just like, you know, Bloodcaster is another flying creature contributing to the Air Force's good. The body isn't amazing or anything, but it can block Auron's Epiphany birds and whatnot. And sometimes it can just come in for damage too. So there's a lot of really cool things about this. Helps you win that sort of card advantage race against other aggro decks. It's really good at doing that. And unlike mono white, we don't have reasons to play 3-drops that aren't this card. So very often this will help us beat mono white in a card advantage race, and that is a good thing to be able to do. But on to some of the stuff you may have seen before, but is sort of a little bit different now that we have different cards, like Falconwrath Pitfighter. I mean, now we have 8 different red 1-drops for this deck, so we get on the board really reliably on turn 1. Now that we have not only this, but Epicure. But this works pretty well with Epicure. If you've gotten in for some damage that turn, you can sacrifice your dorky 1-mana 1/1 Epicure and draw a couple of cards, which is almost always going to be worth it. And this, just like Anje, right, this works pretty well with Edgar tokens. If Edgar is birthing out tokens from his coffin, what are him and Lydia doing in there? Is that the flavor of Edgar? That's nasty. But anyway, if that is what's actually going on. But anyway, you can sacrifice those tokens for 2 cards a turn so long as you have a way of getting in damage. So it's a actually an even better card than it was, and it was already a pretty good Savannah Lions. But there's also the 4 copies of Vampire Socialite, because this is the other Anthem effect in the deck. I mean, the cool thing about this card is that Vampires effectively already had an Anthem, but now they kind of have 2, right? Like, this one is a little bit difficult to make work all the time. You got to kick the tires every now and again, but Edgar now gives us a second Anthem effect that's even more reliable than this one, and this one got more reliable than it was now that we have Voldaren Epicure, right? So Epicure is awesome to play with this, especially again in combination on turn 3, where you go Epicure into Socialite, counter on everything, swing in. So there are a lot of lines that weren't available before with this card that we now have access to. So again, just the addition of Epicure does an awful lot for this deck. But Socialite is as good as it's ever been, and probably even a little bit better. So she's invited to the party, but so is Florian. Only not as many Florian as the last time we did this. In Red Black Vampires, I played 3 of this card, but I'm only going to play 2 this time around because it turned out to be one of the more awkward 3-drops in the deck. I still wanted to hit 8 3-drops, so I'm playing 2 Flow, but it's not as good as, say, Welcoming Vampire, drawing cards a lot of the time, but it can work in conjunction with Welcoming Vampire sometimes, in that you'll deal a couple of damage in the pre-combat step or during your combat step. You'll elect to, of your top 2, 3, 4 cards that you get to see from Florian, you'll elect to get a 2-power creature or less. You'll play that, and then you'll draw the card off of Welcoming Vampire. So sometimes they work pretty well in conjunction together, but Florian is often not quite as impressive, and he's a little harder to cast too, but he can still come to the wedding. He's a fine card, and if we can get in some combat damage on the opponent, we can really start burying them, right? If you're ahead, you're dealing combat damage to the opponent, and Florian can help you get even farther ahead, but it's not quite as good at catching you up as a card like Welcoming Vampire is. So just the 2 copies, mostly because of the legendary status and the awkwardness in the 3-drop slot. And I needed some space in that 3-drop slot because I also wanted 3 main deck copies of Nighthawk Scavenger, which I wasn't playing at first in the main deck. I had 3 copies in the sideboard, but I noticed that they just kept coming in like every single game. They come in for one reason or another, right? Against Mono White, this is the best thing to race them in the entire world. It's really hard for them to deal with this outside of Brutal Cathar and Skyclave Apparition, so they do have answers to this card, but if it gets to swing for more than a turn or 2, it often wins you the game by itself against Mono White. It does very similar things against Mono Green, but if their dudes get a little bit too big for whatever reason, because of Ranger class or just because they start big, this card always has Death Touch and Lifelink, so it takes out whatever you want it to take out, which is a nice thing too, but it's pretty good at racing against that deck too. And even against, like, the Alrund's Epiphany decks, I know that it's a really good target for removal, especially things like Divide and Fading Hope. And they get a lot of mana value off of Fading Hope. So it's not the best play in that matchup, but it also always blocks birds and gains life and makes it harder for them to, it makes them have to take more extra turns effectively to kill you. It always kills a attacking Hull of the Storm Giants and gains you some life. It always kills an attacking Goldspan and gains you some life. And in the meantime, before they get to that point in the game, it usually swings for 2 or 3. So, honestly, Scavenger is a card that I found myself not being able to live without in the main deck, so it's in the main deck. Really good card right now. Now, if you're doing some counting, you may have noticed that's 32 vampires. There's kind of a reason for that, but I also made room for 4 copies of Infernal Grasp here. We needed a good, cheap, instant speed removal spell, and since we're an aggro deck, we can get away with playing Grasp a little bit more because, hopefully we're depleting our opponent's life total faster than cards like this are depleting ours. But sometimes this is a little bit of a liability in some aggro versus aggro matchups like Mono White or Mono Green. So I'm not saying it's the best card in the world, but it does take care of pesky things like, creature lands, faceless havens, and whatnot. Instant speed's very important. How cheap it is important too, because sometimes you can fit in a 2 or 3 drop, still have mana for this card, and that ends up just blowing your opponent out. You'd be surprised how much you miss cheap removal when it's not in your deck. So I'm playing 4 copies of this. Let's get to the lands. There are 24 of them, and altogether there are 13 black sources, 12 red sources, and 10 white sources, but none of that counts Voldaren Estates. So there's actually way more sources for casting things in this deck than it may look like at first glance, and every single card in the deck in the main deck, save for Infernal Grasp, can be cast off of Voldaren Estate, which is one of the big reasons that we're playing almost all creatures in this deck, is so Voldaren Estate can cast all of our cards. And also helps to play a buttload of creatures with Estate, because that means you're a lot more likely to be able to just tap it to get a blood token, which is really good in a whole lot of situations, especially if you're looking for a clock and you've got an Anje out. But let's look at the sideboard, and there's a whole lot more spells in the sideboard, but it's still mostly creatures, I'm not going to lie to you. There are 3 copies of Duress in here, though, to deal with control matchups and Arin's Epiphany and stuff like that. Very important card in the board is Duress, but so is Vampire's Vengeance. This is amazing in most aggro matchups. It's even sometimes good against mono green. I've brought in 2 copies against mono green a few times, and it works against Chariot tokens, Ranger class tokens, and a couple of other things they might play. Sculptor of Winter, Reclusive Taxidermist before it gets 4 creatures in their graveyard. There's a lot of cards. You'd be surprised how much you can pick up, but obviously this is mostly when we're on the play against mono white. Vampire's Vengeance can be a blowout card. Play those 3 copies. Aside from that, though, it's all creatures. We've got another copy of Anje in here for slower, again, more creature-based matchups where we know we're going to stalemate a little bit. Anje breaks those matchups wide open. Falcon Wrath Forebear, we need 3 copies of this against control decks. Aside from that, Dominating Vampire for the creature matchups, but just a couple of copies of this. It is double red, but it's going to be really worth it again against mono white, and in some cases against mono green. They have big creatures, but those creatures aren't very expensive. You'd be surprised how easy it is to steal an old growth troll for a turn, right? And then sacrifice it to an Anje, which is a really good thing to be able to do with Dominating Vampire. So there's a lot of sweet little tricks with this card, but mostly it helps us win the race and the tempo game against white decks. Now, you may have noticed there were some cards that I did not play in this deck. I've already talked about Olivia for a brief second. Obviously, this card cost a little bit too much for this deck. I feel like it's better in a sort of combo Reanimator deck, or maybe a treasure deck, or a combination of both of those kinds of decks. So, didn't quite make the cut here. Bloodvow Purveyor is a bad Magic card. It just is a bad Magic card. On Rika, I'm not sure if this is a bad Magic card yet, but it doesn't quite go in this deck. Again, the 4-drop slot is really fat here. And Rika seems like a more straight-up mid-range kind of card. Sorin, same. We have a lot of 4-drops in this deck. Maybe Sorin could have a place in the sideboard as a kind of anti-control card. They have to have 2 cards to deal with, right? Because they have to deal with the creature and the planeswalker. But sometimes that's a lot easier than it seems for decks like that, right? So Sorin just didn't seem right for this deck, either in the main or the board. And again, we're very 4-drop heavy. I also didn't play Bloodthirsty Adversary because there just really aren't enough spells in this deck. But here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 66, which is not bad. It's not the best score in the world. We've seen 68, 69, 70. I think there's been a single 71 in the history of the channel, if I'm not mistaken. So we've seen higher scores before, but 66 is pretty good. And I haven't even told you the price yet because, surprisingly, this deck is $150 right now to play, which is less than a 3-color deck should cost, to be honest, and most of the cost is in the mana base. So give Mardu Vampires a chance. It does not suck as much as you think, and I know that I've used the suck joke a few times in this video, but it's vampires. It's in my blood. I got to do it. Hey, but anyway, the deck is actually really fun, so I hope you get a chance to play with this thing. Again, it's really cheap to order on TCG Player, a lot less than a 3-color deck should cost in Standard. Most of them are $500. This thing, relatively breezy $150. It's not budget or anything, but again, could be worse. So give this thing a shot if you possibly can. Aside from all that, just shoot me a like if you enjoyed the content. Sub if you haven't done that yet, because we're trying to get to 5 million subscribers. We just got to 124K. I want to thank all of you for that. Appreciate you helping me get there. But let's get to at least 125K next, because it feels a little bit more milestone-y, right? Let's get there. But aside from that, the march to 5 million continues. But if you want to do any of this stuff, you can do it too. Watch me play Magic at least 2, if not 3 nights a week over on Twitch, and we have a freaking ball playing magical cards over there. So come over there. It's free to follow on Twitch if you didn't know that. Aside from that, you can check out the Patreon. It's $1 a month to vote on what decks we do here on the channel, which is the whole reason I'm doing Mardu Vampires first. So thanks, patrons. You gave me a 5-day logic puzzle to do that almost made me tear my brain out, but we figured it out. In the end, I really think we came up to a good list here. But aside from that, follow me on Twitter for the occasional thing I say on Twitter. Aside from that, I guess I'm done with this one. So let me know how you felt about it in the comments section down there, how you done things differently, if you played the deck, how you enjoyed it, all that stuff. And of course, tell me what an epicure is. But aside from that, I'm done for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.